has asked us to read stories from Mark 3 and Mark 5, some healing stories of Jesus.
Jesus departed with his disciples to the sea, and a great multitude from Galilee followed him. Hearing all that he was doing, they came to him in great numbers from Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, beyond the Jordan, and the region around Tyre and Sidon. He told his disciples to have a boat ready for him because of the crowd, so that they would not crush him. For he had cured many, so that all who had diseases pressed on him to touch him.
When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So Jesus went with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him.
Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease."
While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter's dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to Jairus, the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make such a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, she's just sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside, and he took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in to where the girl was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this. See how well that worked? He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat.
Thank you. So now I have the pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Paul Leichty, who, as you might know, is our executive director of MHF. Part-time plus, I like to say. He's our part-time director, but certainly puts in that extra many hours to make everything work for us. He's been director since 2011 when MHF first came to fruition, starting in Goshen, Indiana, and then now living in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. I've learned a lot about him over the years, how hardworking he is, how dedicated he is to MHF's mission, but also many other things over his many years at work within the church and other communities. Paul's experience with issues of health and faith is a result of his past roles in both family and church. He's a longtime advocate of the holistic vision of health in the context of family and community, having paid particular attention to those who have often been marginalized in communities of faith due to physical, sensory, psychiatric, or intellectual disabilities. He's the father of 2 children, one of whom has a significant developmental disability. and has interacted, because of this, has interacted with a variety of healthcare professionals over the years. More recently, Paul's been involved in advocacy and work to integrate persons with disabilities into the church and community. So Paul has 16 years of pastoral and music director experience in several cross-cultural urban congregations in Illinois and Indiana. He's also worked to help start up or reorganize various community and church-related organizations, such as Congregational Accessibility Network and Anabaptist Disabilities Network. He also spent 4 years working with Mennonite.net, which helps congregations and church-related organizations with digital communications and marketing, which I've had the pleasure of learning a lot from him with those skills in MHF. And now we'll get to hear from him speaking on salvation, therapy, cure, and health. So welcome, Paul Leichty.
On the night of December 15th, 2016, I lay in the intensive care unit of Williamsport Regional Medical Center, hooked up to a maze of tubes, medical devices, and machines, teetering between life and death. A week earlier, in the wee hours of the morning of December 8th, I had gone to the emergency department with pain radiating up both shoulders into my neck and head. After a number of tests, the medical staff diagnosed me with muscle spasms and sent me home. The next day, when my symptoms hadn't improved, I went to the local urgent care facility just blocks from our home, a home that we had just moved to 2.5 weeks earlier. Well, it didn't take long before I was in an ambulance en route back to the hospital, told that I was having a heart attack. By then, it was 40 hours in duration. That's about the last thing I remember for the week that followed. What I was later told was that I had one stent inserted in the catheter lab. Then I developed ventricular fibrillation and other heart arrhythmias, which gravely complicated matters. I had several more heart attacks and was repeatedly shocked back into rhythm. I was hooked up to extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, or ECMO, a machine that took blood from my veins and pumped it back into my arteries, bypassing the heart and thus allowing it to rest. By December 15th, the medical staff at Williamsport Regional Medical Center determined that they were at the end of the resources they could offer me. So in situations like this, the question becomes, what do you do now? What happens when you come to the end of the road, so to speak? Where do you go when the lifeline is failing? Where do you go when you are ill, the doctors have tried everything and nothing seems to work? Where do you go when the medical folks say you are dying? Where do you go when you seemingly have no other options? In the gospel accounts, we have a number of stories where people in the first century faced this kind of dilemma, albeit in a very different way than I did in December 2016. The Gospel of Mark in particular introduces Jesus as a person who was able to heal people that no one thought could be healed. And so people started coming from near and far. In Mark 3, 9, and 10, we read that Jesus told his disciples to have a boat ready for him because of the crowd, so that they would not crush him. For he had cured many, it says, so that all who had diseases pressed upon him to touch him. People came from miles around seeking to be healed from their illness or condition. They came out of such desperation that it threatened to crush Jesus himself. They came to be saved from death itself. Then 2 chapters later in Mark, we have a passage in which we find 2 prime examples of this end-of-the-rope desperation. A story within a story. In the first story, we have a synagogue leader with a critically ill daughter. Now, one of the things that makes this remarkable is that many synagogue leaders were not exactly on friendly terms with Jesus these days. And yet this man, Jairus, came up to Jesus, fell at his feet, and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." The other story is of an anonymous woman with a bleeding condition. And even though she was not supposed to be even out in public with her condition, she made her way through the crowd to simply touch Jesus' clothing in her desperate attempt to be healed. So what is it that people are seeking in this desperate quest for healing? Is that the same thing I was seeking in those occasional moments on the night of December 15th, 2016, when I came out of sedation enough to know a little bit of what was happening? Is it the same thing that the medical team in Williamsport was seeking for me as their patient when they decided to call in the medevac helicopter and fly me to Presbyterian Hospital at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center? I want to explore some answers to these questions by looking at the language of healing that is used in these biblical stories, as well as reflecting on my own story. I want to focus on 4 specific words in the original Greek language in which the Gospels were written. I've translated those 4 words into the 4 key words of the title of this message. And yet all 4 words have been translated in some English Bibles with some form of the word heal. And this suggests that these 4 words bring different nuances of meaning to our understanding of healing. Understanding those nuances, I would suggest, as illustrated in these stories, can help us move toward a fuller understanding of the meaning of healing in the ministry of Jesus. And that understanding has profound implications for how the church, as well as individual Christian healthcare professionals, carry out God's ministry of healing in our world today. First of all, we return to the 2 verses in which Mark sets the context for Jesus' healing ministry. In Mark 3:10, when he says that Jesus had cured or healed many, we have the Greek word therapeo, from which we get our word therapy. In today's healthcare systems, therapy refers to treatment intended to relieve or heal a disorder. So the leader's daughter had a disorder. She was sick and dying. The woman had a bleeding disorder, which made her unclean. I had a heart disorder, which led to heart damage and irregular rhythms. Thus, treatment was applied. Therapy was given to relieve or heal the disorder. Now, looking back, I had some amazing therapies that have enabled me to be restored to the level of health I enjoy today. The heart catheterization lab became a place of therapy. And the most notable objects of that therapy were the stents that opened up the blood vessels in my heart so that blood could flow freely through them again. Then there was that high-tech ECMO machine, which allowed my heart time to rest. There were medication therapies, nursing treatments, respiratory therapies, and later the long needles inserted into my back to draw out hundreds of milliliters of fluid from around my lungs. Then when I was well enough to return to Williamsport for rehab, there was physical therapy to regain strength in bedridden muscles. Occupational therapy to do such mundane things as dress myself. Psychological therapy to ascertain if my brain was still functioning as before. Speech therapy to counter the effects of breathing tube down my throat for so many days. And more respiratory therapy to counteract the toxic effects to my lungs of a drug that was supposed to treat my heart arrhythmias. Today we would probably distinguish between the treatment or therapy and its intended effect of healing. However, Mark 3:10 says that Jesus had cured or healed or literally applied therapy to many. So what is at the root of this word for therapy? Well, according to some scholars, the root concept of the Greek word therapeo is to serve. Thus, to provide said therapy is to serve in the process of healing. To be a therapist is to give one's time, talents, energies, and skills in service for the healing of another. It is to give a piece of one's own life for the life of another. And so when Mark says that Jesus healed, or literally therapied, many, he was writing about Jesus giving his life for the healing of the world. For the life of the world, Jesus gave his life. And as followers of Jesus, we are called to give of our lives in healing service to a broken and hurting world. Again, I can't begin to count the number of therapists or servants of healing who gave of themselves so that I can stand before you today. To be a Christian healthcare worker is to realize that we do as Jesus did, carrying out the role of a therapist, a life-giving servant to those whom we treat. So our first healing word, therapy or service. Secondly, we find the second of these healing words in connection with what happened to the woman with the condition of bleeding. When she touched the clothes of Jesus, Mark says she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Other versions translated healed of her affliction, or even freed from her suffering. Here is another Greek word, iaomai, means to cure or to restore, to bring freedom from the suffering of the disease or condition. Now, in English, we sometimes talk about being restored to health. And so this woman was freed of her chronic disease, cured, healed, restored to health. And yet this meaning of healing has more implications than just being restored to physical health. You see, because of the Old Testament purity laws surrounding a woman's menstruation, a condition of chronic bleeding meant that she was continually impure. This would make anyone who she was in contact with impure. This would make her unwelcome in public. Her family would need to keep their distance. She would have been essentially an outcast in her own community. And so to restore her to health was not just a cure in the physical sense of stopping or drying up her bleeding, to use a literal translation of another word. By touching the hem of Jesus' cloak, she could again be in touch with her family, friends, her community. She was restored to her community. By being restored to community, she would have also experienced an emotional and spiritual restoration. She no longer had to be troubled about why she had to suffer such a condition ongoing, such a chronic condition. She no longer needed to worry about being ostracized by her community. She was no longer prevented from going to the temple to worship God. Her healing was a complete cure of mind, body, spirit, and relationships. She was instead restored to the fullness of health. This sense of complete healing is conveyed through yet a third word. Oh, I'm sorry. I have another thing to say about that. It's really impossible for me to fully assess or express the healing effects of being a part of a loving Christian community. So for me to be restored to community had many aspects. Having Twyla by my side in Pittsburgh and knowing that many miles away, out of their way, people were making her presence possible by taking care of things back at home, that was to be in touch with my community. Seeing family members and friends who traveled many miles out of their way to visit me in Pittsburgh, when I could even hardly even speak, was priceless. And then to come back to Williamsport for rehab, even though it had only been my hometown for less than a month when I flew away, was to be restored, nevertheless, to my community. To come back home after rehab to a house that I had just barely moved into was still to be restored to my community, to my home. To worship at Agape Fellowship, even though I could just barely call it my church, was nevertheless an emotional experience. And as the summer progressed, to be present in Goshen at my former church, at last year's annual gathering at Laurelville, to be reunited with my sister who would make countless phone calls on my behalf from California and Illinois, well, it was simply amazing. And then there was the reading of those emails about me, realizing the impact of many prayers. Those were the prayers of the community. Part of God's healing, restoring work. To be cured, to be healed, is to be restored to the relationships that mean the most. The relationships at the core of our life in Christ. This sense of complete healing is conveyed through yet a third word in which Jesus affirms this woman's healing. It comes at the end of chapter 5, verse 34. Jesus says, "Go in peace and be healed of your disease. This is yet another word. The word hugies, from which we get our English word hygiene. The word carries the implications of a complete health and wholeness. For many people today, hygiene carries the implications of cleanliness and sanitation. And yet its dictionary definition is much broader than that. Hygiene or hygienics is defined as the science that deals with the promotion and preservation of health. And the second definition is the conditions and practices that serve to promote or preserve health. Now, certainly sanitation and cleanliness is a big part of hygiene, promoting and preserving health. It's a big part of the underlying reason for the purity laws in the Old Testament. But good hygiene is more than just an obsessive compulsive desire to be clean. And hygiene is much more than the absence of disease. Hygiene also involves eating right, exercising appropriately, avoiding harmful substances, promoting healthy relationships with others and with God. To consider carefully the full implications of this word, hygiene, we need to realize that my hygiene and health is also bound up with your hygiene and health. If the water in our community is contaminated, none of us will have good hygiene. If the food we buy has a residue of chemical pesticides that are not easily washed away, then anyone who eats that food has the potential to become ill. If the air we breathe is filled with pollutants, the health of all who breathe that air is affected. So this particular word for healing is about the total overall health of the whole person in the whole community. This is reinforced when Jesus says, "Go in peace and be healed of your disease." The word for peace here is the word that is used to translate the Old Testament Hebrew word shalom. In the Bible, peace or shalom is never just about the absence of conflict. When the Jews greeted each other or said goodbye to each other saying shalom, they weren't saying, "Well, I hope you don't get in any conflicts with your family." They were wishing each other a total sense of well-being, good physical health, an emotional sense of well-being, healthy relationships, and most of all, God's blessing over it all. Shalom in its fullness is a wholeness and well-being of human life in community as God originally intended it. Freedom from sin, from sickness, from disease, from conflict, from all the suffering and consequences that go with the human condition. And so we too participate in a healing ministry as we seek the shalom, the hygiene of health, not only for ourselves, but for all of the persons in the community. Now, I confess that before my cancer in 2014 and my heart attack in 2016, I thought of myself as a pretty healthy person, striving to live a healthy lifestyle. I walked or biked the 8 blocks to work while I lived in Goshen whenever possible. In the winter, my exercise was shoveling snow by hand. Starting about 10 years ago, I made a conscious effort to bring down my cholesterol, lose weight by modifying my diet. I was proud of the fact that I brought my cholesterol down to where I didn't need statins anymore. I thought I was appropriately dealing with the stress in my life. And so neither I nor the physician assistant who had treated me in the emergency room thought I fit the profile for being at risk of a heart attack. And yet it happened. Whether it was hereditary or too many hamburgers over the years or internalizing more stress than I realized or some other combination of factors, it's not clear. And yet I, as a white, middle-class, North American male, did not defy the statistics. The diseases of my country and my class and my kin and my gender were now my diseases. I now need to take further steps that include diet and exercise and the addition of regular prescription medications. And then medications, of course, bring their own consequences. I now have plenty of firsthand experience with how treating one set of life-threatening conditions can bring with it possible side effects that can also be life-threatening. The disruption in the hygiene and health and shalom has implications that cannot be magically fixed by a pill. And so, although I came home from rehab in mid-January of 2017, I still spent most of January and February in the hospital. A medication to treat my heart arrhythmias was toxic to my lungs. It had a half-life of 45 days. Then a blood thinner that I was on caused excessive bleeding. And then, of all things, when in the summer, several weeks after, both my cardiologist and my primary care physician said, "Why didn't we put you on statins?" And realized their oversight and then remedied it, I was back in the hospital again with what they thought was what was it now? It was liver, no, not liver, but gallbladder. Anyway, all kinds of tests. Eventually, though, between all the specialists, they decided that it was probably a result of the reaction to the statins. So I went from one statin to another statin, and then finally my cardiologist, who had put me on the lowest dosage of atorvastatin, said, "Well, you can skip a couple days a week." Anyway, I'm only a tiny microcosm of how we have, as human beings, have disturbed this shalom, this order that God intended, and disrupted and destroyed our environment in which God intended us to live. And so we face those consequences even when we try to remedy them. We are collectively responsible for the toxicity and hunger and disease that unfortunately disproportionately affects those who are already sick and poor and needy. Our world is far from good hygiene and shalom. And yet that is at the heart of Jesus' ministry of health and wholeness. When he says, "Go in peace and be healed of your disease." 3 words we've considered: therapy, cure, and health. And yet, even in those 3 words, we need at least one other final word. And this is the word that is used several times in this passage, as well as extensively throughout the New Testament. It's a word that gathers together all of the meanings of the other words that we have looked at. It's the word for healing that has been used and misused in the history of the church. We see it first in the outer story. Jairus, the leader of the synagogue, begs Jesus, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be saved. He may well and live." And then in Mark 5:28, the woman with the bleeding said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be saved. I will be healed." And in Mark 5:34, before Jesus says, "Go in peace and be healed," with that other word, he first says, "Daughter, your faith has saved you." has healed you. Now you notice that I've used saved and healed back to back. You won't find the translation saved in many Bibles in these passages. But it's the same word in the Greek, sozo, that is most often translated in most other passages as saved. So, for instance, the word is the same one used in Acts 16:31, where the Apostle Paul tells the Philippian jailer, "Believe on the Lord Jesus and you will be saved." It's back in Mark 8:35. Jesus says, "For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it." The different translations reflect the fact that in the English language we have tried to make distinctions between physical health and spiritual salvation, and yet they're part and parcel of each other. We've lost the connection between the peace and wholeness, between health and salvation. But the healing stories in the Gospels show that Jesus, as one who saves from all human conditions of sin, suffering, sickness, disease, climate change, environmental poisoning, conflict, and war, anything that destroys or disrupts the shalom in which God intended us to live. And thus Jairus pleads for his daughter. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well, may be saved and live. The woman with the bleeding condition says to herself, if I but touch his clothes, I will be made well, I will be saved. And in verse 34, Jesus says, daughter, your faith has made you well, has saved you. It's that same faith. Daughter, your faith has made you well. It's that same faith that Jesus calls forth then from the leader of the synagogue as we wrap up the story. When they tell him his daughter is dead and he says, do not fear, only believe. It is a faith that seems laughably ridiculous to the worldly mourners who gathered around the lifeless body of that daughter. But Jesus' pronouncement that the child is not dead, but sleeping, is but an invitation to all of us to get a foretaste, a glimpse into the power of the resurrection through a saving, healing ministry and movement of God that breaks into our present situation. And so on the night of December 15 and 16, 2016, I drifted in and out of station. I remember only these three things. First, I was somehow aware that I was being flown by helicopter to Pittsburgh. I really don't even know how. I was aware of that. Then I felt multiple shocks as the medical team tried to get my heart back into rhythm. I remember counting up to 10. And thirdly, I remember praying, my times are in your hands. And I associated that phrase with another phrase, into your hand I commit my spirit. Those words stayed with me in the months that followed. And yet, somehow I never thought to look them up, see where they came from, until many months later. I found them both in Psalm 31. Psalm 31, verse 5. Into your hand I commit my spirit. You have redeemed me, O Lord, faithful God. And then later, in verses 15 and 16, my times are in your hand. Deliver me from the hand of my enemies and persecutors. Let your face shine upon your servant. Save me in your steadfast love. And then I looked at the overall psalm 31, and I saw the theme. Probably can be best summarized in verse 2. Be a rock of refuge for me, a strong fortress to save me. Three words, therapy, cure, and health, speak primarily to the present reality as Jesus touches lives in the present moment in ways that at the same time offer a glimpse of the restoration of God's ideal future. But that word save or salvation in the New Testament speaks of a reality that spans past and present and future that we can enter into now by faith. Truly, as we experience the touch of Jesus, even just the hem of his garment, so to speak, we dwell in the hands of a loving Creator God who desires health and wholeness, peace and salvation for us all. And so in these extra days that I have been given, I am often reminded to pray, even in the little things, the complications of life, to breathe that prayer, my times are in your hands. And I do so in the knowledge that my Lord, the great healer himself, uttered his final words from Psalm 31. Luke puts it this way. Then Jesus, crying out with a loud voice, said, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. And having said this, he breathed his last. And so whether I continue to live in this world or die physically, I do so knowing that I am in God's hands. The assurance of salvation that has brought me a temporary healing is but a foretaste of the reality of the fullness of health and wholeness awaiting me in resurrection glory. So we come back to the four words for health used in these brief passages about Jesus' healing ministry, but used even further in the rest of the Bible and in the life of the church today as we continue the healing work of Jesus. Salvation, therapy, cure, and health. Here we get a glimpse of the meaning of healing for our own lives and for our ministry as disciples of Jesus. All the healing words encompass a meaning that goes beyond our comprehension, but we get a glimpse. All of the healing stories from the Old Testament and the gospel accounts of Jesus' healing ministry and the apostles' ministry, to our own stories of healing today that we have shared this weekend, point us to the power of God to bring about a final and complete healing and wholeness in the end. And it is this full and final and all-encompassing healing that we accept by faith. We have seen the multifaceted meaning of healing in the gospel stories, the stories of Jesus at work in both the first century and the 21st. Healing is therapy and service. Jesus' presence among the crowds of this world to give his life to bring healing and hope to others. Healing is cure and restoration as people are restored to the health of body, mind, spirit, and relationships. And healing is hygiene and wholeness, a public health that seeks the shalom of each individual in the context of the whole community. And finally, then, there's healing as salvation. As we, in the final analysis, too, are called in the midst of our own desperate situations, at the end of our rope, to seek Jesus, to heed Jesus' words to Jairus. Do not fear, only believe. We can commit our future into the hands of God. God's resurrection power demonstrated in Jesus will heal, will save.